Seville, 1527. A young priest gazes at the ships departing for the New World. He has sold everything. He has given everything to the poor. He is ready to set sail. But an order from the archbishop stops him at the dock. He will not board. His mission will be another. In that moment of apparent failure begins the story of the man who would reform the Church of Spain. Spain, 16th century. The most powerful empire in the world extends its dominions from Flanders to the Philippines. But behind the facade of glory, the Spanish Church suffers a profound crisis. Priests who barely know the Latin of the Mass they celebrate, faithful who confuse superstition with faith, and a society that looks with suspicion upon those who carry converso blood in their veins. It is in this turbulent setting where the figure of John of Ávila emerges. Born in Almodóvar del Campo around 1500, son of conversos, marked from the cradle by the stigma of a suspicious genealogy. A man whom the Inquisition will imprison, whom the powerful will fear, and whom the saints will seek out as their master. Saint Teresa will send him the manuscript of her life. Saint John of God will receive from him peace of soul. Saint Francis Borgia will follow his counsel. 4 centuries later, the Church will proclaim him universal doctor. This is his story. Almodóvar del Campo, in the heart of La Mancha, welcomes little John on the 6th of January, the feast of the Epiphany, between 1499 and 1500. The date is no coincidence for those who see in it a sign. The child born on the Feast of the Magi is destined to seek, like them, the true light. His father, Alonso of Ávila, prospers as a merchant, but carries the invisible weight of his converso lineage. His mother, Catalina Gijón, imprints upon the boy's soul a deep piety that will never leave him. In that Spain obsessed with purity of blood, being descended from converted Jews means living under perpetual suspicion, finding doors closed before even knocking, constantly proving a faith that others take for granted. The young John soon displays a dazzling intelligence. At 14, his parents sent him to Salamanca, the most illustrious university in the Hispanic kingdoms, to study law. 4 years he spends among codes and decrees, among legal disputes and worldly ambitions. But something breaks inside him. The laws of men do not quench his thirst. He returns to Almodóvar plunged into a crisis his parents cannot understand. He does not want to be a lawyer. He does not want honors or privileges. He wants something more, something he cannot yet name. It is then that a Franciscan friar, Fernando de Contreras, recognizes in that restless young man the mark of a higher calling. He advises him to study at Alcalá de Henares, where Cardinal Cisneros has founded a new university, open to Christian humanism, a center of spiritual renewal that shakes the old molds. Alcalá transforms John. Under masters like Domingo de Soto, he immerses himself in theology, in philosophy, in biblical languages. He learns to read the scriptures in Hebrew and Greek. He discovers the Church Fathers. He absorbs Erasmian humanism, but purifies it of its excesses, anchoring it in a robust Christology. Above all, he learns to pray. Prayer becomes the center of his existence, the wellspring from which everything else will flow. Around 1526, he receives priestly ordination. Shortly after, death takes his parents. John, an only child, inherits a considerable fortune. What will he do with it? The answer is radical. He sells everything, absolutely everything, and distributes the money among the poor. He strips himself of all earthly burden, and then, free from all ties, he conceives a dream to cross the ocean, to evangelize the Indies, to give his life for those newly discovered peoples who do not know Christ. With his heart burning with apostolic zeal, John heads to Seville, the port from which ships depart for the New World. He has discerned his vocation. He has burned his bridges. There is no turning back, or so he believes. Because God, who writes straight with crooked lines, has other plans for that young priest who gazes upon the Guadalquivir without knowing that his true mission lies not across the sea, but on the very ground beneath his feet. The Archbishop of Seville, Don Alonso Manrique, was a man of piercing gaze and sound judgment. When he learned that a young priest burning with inner fire was waiting at the port to sail for the Indies, he summoned him. The interview was brief but decisive. Manrique had heard John preach, or at least had received reports of that eloquence that stirred consciences. Spain, he told him, is full of Christians who live like pagans. Andalusia has entire villages where the name of Christ is barely an empty sound. The Indies can wait. This land needs you now. John listened in silence. His whole being rebelled against those words. He had renounced everything precisely to cross the sea. He had dreamed of martyrdom among unknown peoples. And now, when the ship was about to set sail, a prelate was closing the door on him. But John had learned something in Alcalá that he now had to put into practice. The apostle does not choose his mission, he receives it. He bowed his head and obeyed. The first sermons in Seville were like a fire no one expected. John would climb into the pulpit, and churches would fill to overflowing. He did not preach like the others. He did not lose himself in theological subtleties or rhetorical displays. He spoke of Christ, of the crucified Christ, of the love that led God to become man and die among thieves. He spoke of sin without mincing words, but offered mercy with a tenderness that disarmed even the most hardened. The Sevillian merchants, accustomed to lukewarm sermons that did not disturb their shady dealings, left the church with their souls in turmoil. Public sinners confessed in tears. Ladies of the nobility abandoned their vanities. The poor found in his words a dignity the world denied them. All of Seville was talking about the preacher from Almodovar. But where there is light, shadows stir. John's success awakened envy and suspicion. His converso origins were an easy weapon for his enemies. In 1531, someone denounced him to the Inquisition. The charges were vague, that his sermons sounded like Lutheranism, that he exalted divine grace too much, that he criticized the clergy too harshly. In truth, what bothered them was his power over souls and his tainted blood. John was arrested and taken to the prisons of the Holy Office. For nearly 2 years he remained locked away, without knowing exactly what he was accused of, unable to defend himself, subjected to interrogations designed to make him stumble. The Inquisition's prison was a limbo of uncertainty, designed to break wills. Many emerged from it destroyed, even if declared innocent. John did not break. In the darkness of his cell, he discovered a freedom no jailer could take from him. He prayed as he had never prayed before. He meditated on the passion of Christ, on the just one unjustly condemned, on the innocent one who remained silent before his accusers. He wrote reflections that would later nourish his works. When finally, in 1533, the tribunal absolved him of all charges, John emerged from prison not as a bitter man, but as steel tempered by fire. The trial had taught him what no book could teach, the taste of unjust persecution, communion with the suffering Christ, the peace that only God can give when everything else crumbles. Now he was truly prepared for his mission. Now he knew that preaching the gospel comes at a price, and he was willing to pay it. Córdoba became John of Ávila's new center of operations after his acquittal. From there, during 3 decades of tireless labor, he would weave a network of spiritual renewal that would cover all of Andalusia like a mesh of light. His pastoral method broke with everything that had been established. While other preachers were content with momentarily moving the crowds, John thought about the next day, the next year, the generations to come. He understood that conversion without formation is like seed on rocky ground. It sprouts quickly, but withers at the first sun. That is why he founded schools for children from humble families, convinced that ignorance is the mother of all superstitions and the breeding ground for all vices. These schools were not mere elementary institutions. In them, solid catechism was taught, consciences were formed, the seeds of future vocations were planted. But his most revolutionary work were the houses of priestly formation. True seminaries before the Council of Trent made their foundation mandatory. John had seen too many priests who could barely read the Missal, who were ignorant of the Scriptures, who lived in concubinage or given over to greed. He knew that without holy shepherds, the flock scatters. That is why he gathered young men with vocations and formed them himself. He taught them theology, instilled in them a love for prayer, showed them by his example what it means to be a priest of Jesus Christ. The disciples who gathered around him formed what history would come to know as the Ávilists. They were not a religious order, nor a formal congregation, but a fraternity of spirits united by the same ideal, the reform of the Church from within, beginning with one's own holiness. These men would carry the spirit of Master Ávila throughout Spain, multiplying his influence far beyond what a single man could achieve. But the opposition never ceased entirely. The stigma of being a converso continued to weigh upon John like an invisible stone. The blood purity statutes, that aberration that excluded from ecclesiastical positions those who had Jewish or Muslim ancestors, closed doors to him that his talent deserved to open. John suffered this injustice in silence most of the time, but when the occasion required it, he denounced with prophetic courage that in Christ there is no distinction of bloodlines, that baptism erases all differences, that a church that discriminates by genealogies betrays the very heart of the gospel. His words made many uncomfortable, but those who had ears to hear recognized in them the echo of St. Paul. Meanwhile, his body began to betray him. A chronic illness, probably a severe form of arthritis, slowly took hold of his joints. The pains became constant, the nights endless, his movements increasingly difficult. But John did not surrender to the illness. If he could not travel the roads as before, he would write. His pen became his new pulpit. The letters he sent to those under his spiritual direction circulated from hand to hand, copied again and again, read aloud in entire communities. It is in these years of increasing prostration that he composed his masterpiece. The treatise Audi Filia, born as a letter of spiritual direction for a young noblewoman named Sancha Carrillo, and transformed over time into a classic of Spanish mysticism. In its pages, John poured everything he had learned about the love of God, about the interior combat, about the path toward union with Christ. Saint Teresa of Jesus would read it years later and confess that it had done her much good. Saint John of the Cross would drink from its sources. Saint Francis de Sales would recommend it to those under his direction. But John did not limit himself to writing for individual souls. When the Spanish bishops departed for Trent for the great council that would reform the church, the Archbishop of Granada asked him to draft memorials on the most urgent matters. John wrote 2 extraordinary texts that reached the conciliar assembly: concrete proposals for the creation of diocesan seminaries, for the reform of preaching, for the catechetical formation of the people, for the effective residence of bishops in their sees. Many of the provisions that the Council of Trent would approve bore, unbeknownst to the Council Fathers, the mark of the thought of that converso priest who wrote from a corner of Andalusia. His correspondence with the great saints of his time reveals the magnitude of his influence. Teresa of Jesus sent him the manuscript of her life for him to examine, and he encouraged her to persevere on her path of reform. John of Dios found in his words the peace that his tormented soul sought. Francisco de Borja consulted him before abandoning his ducal titles to enter the Society of Jesus. Pedro de Alcántara counted him among his dearest friends. The most reform-minded bishops of Spain sought his counsel. The most pious nobles wanted his spiritual direction. And yet, when they offered him mitres and canonries, he refused them all. "I do not want benefices," he said once. "I want souls." That phrase summarizes his entire life. Montilla, a whitewashed village among the olive groves of Córdoba, became Master Ávila's final refuge. There, in an austere cell that smelled of lime and rosemary, John's body waged its final battle against illness, while his spirit reached heights that health had never allowed him. His bones burned. His joints had become knots of pain that each dawn tightened with greater force. Celebrating Mass had become a calvary. Raising the chalice required superhuman effort. Pronouncing the words of consecration drew tears that mingled with those of the sacrifice. But John did not complain. He had learned that suffering accepted with love transforms into prayer, and his broken body had become his most eloquent pulpit. Those who came to visit expecting to find a defeated old man left bewildered. This man who could barely move radiated a peace that they, healthy and free, did not know. In his sick room, John received bishops and beggars, noble ladies and illiterate peasants, priests in crisis and repentant sinners. For all he had the right word, the precise counsel, a gaze that seemed to read the depths of the soul. It was during those years of prostration that John reached the summit of his teaching on the priesthood, distilling into burning words everything he had lived and contemplated during 40 years of ministry. The priest, he wrote, is not a functionary of the sacred, nor an administrator of rites. He is another Christ, ontologically configured with the high priest through the grace of holy orders. This identity admits no mediocrity. A lukewarm priest is worse than a cold layman, because his lukewarmness scandalizes the little ones and gives arguments to the enemies of the church. A worldly priest who seeks honors, riches, or pleasures is a living blasphemy, because he profanes with his life what he consecrates with his hands. But a holy priest, even if ignorant and clumsy, even if lacking eloquence and brilliant talents, is the greatest treasure a diocese can possess. These words were not born from theory, but from experience. John had seen unworthy priests destroy entire parishes, and he had seen holy priests transform villages. He himself had chosen poverty when he could have been rich, anonymity when he could have sought bishops' mitres, service when he could have demanded honors. His doctrine on the priesthood was not an abstract ideal, but his own biography transformed into teaching. The final months were a long preparation for the definitive encounter. John put his affairs in order with the meticulousness of one who knows that time is running out. He dictated his last letters to distant disciples, letters that seemed like spiritual testaments, condensations of an entire lifetime of wisdom. He asked forgiveness from anyone he might have offended with his frankness, for he knew that his zeal had sometimes wounded sensibilities. He received the last sacraments with a devotion that moved all present. Confession, as one who strips away the last traces of dust before entering the king's palace. The Eucharist as the viaticum of the pilgrim who already glimpses the towers of his homeland. Anointing as the armor of the soldier preparing for the final battle. Those surrounding him held their breath, aware they were witnessing something sacred. On the 10th of May, 1569, when the afternoon sun gilded the white walls of Montilla, John of Ávila spoke his last words. "Lord, now it is time to walk." It was 3 o'clock, the hour when Christ expired on Golgotha. He was 69 years old. He had spent more than 40 preaching Jesus Christ, and now he was going to see him face to face. News of his death spread through Andalusia like a shiver of mourning. In Córdoba and Seville, in Granada and Jaén, in large towns and forgotten hamlets, people wept for Master Ávila as one weeps for a father. Those who had known him immediately began to testify to his holiness, his heroic virtues, the graces they had received through his intercession. His body was buried in the Church of the Incarnation in Montilla, and his tomb soon became a place of pilgrimage. The disciples he had formed, the Avilists scattered throughout Spain, gathered his legacy and perpetuated it in schools, in seminaries, in transformed parishes. The man who had wanted to die a martyr in the Indies had died in his bed, in an Andalusian village, surrounded by his own. But his martyrdom had been another kind, the slow martyrdom of accepted illness, of endured misunderstanding, of faithfulness sustained day after day for decades. And that white martyrdom, invisible to the world, now shone with the light of eternity. The seed that John of Ávila planted in Andalusian soil did not take long to bear fruit 100-fold. Even before his body had grown cold in Montilla, his disciples were already scattered across the Spanish landscape like embers from the same fire. The schools he had founded continued forming generations of children who would grow up knowing their faith. The seminaries he had inspired kept molding priests according to the pattern he had traced with his life more than with his words. The Avilists, that informal brotherhood of souls ignited by the same ideal, carried his spirit to the most remote corners of the kingdom, preaching as he had preached, hearing confessions as he had heard them, loving the poor as he had loved them. His writings, copied again and again by devoted hands, crossed borders he never traversed in life. The Audi, Filia reached Italy, France, Flanders, the very Indies he could not set foot upon. Jesuit missionaries carried it as far as Japan. The voice of Master Ávila, who never left Andalusia, now resonated in tongues he never heard. The path toward official recognition of his sanctity was, however, as tortuous as his life had been. The beatification process began promptly, driven by popular acclaim and the testimony of those who had known him. But obstacles multiplied like the heads of a hydra. His converso status, which had pursued him in life, pursued him also after death. The old inquisitorial accusations, though he had been absolved, left a shadow of suspicion that the promoters of his cause had to dispel again and again. Wars, revolutions, changes of pontificate, the bureaucratic complications typical of the Roman Curia, all kept delaying the process decade after decade, century after century. Entire generations of devotees were born and died, waiting to see Master Ávila raised to the altars. Finally, in 1894, Pope Leo XIII declared him blessed. 76 years later, in 1970, Paul VI inscribed him in the catalogue of saints. But the most significant recognition was yet to come. On October 12, 2012, Benedict XVI proclaimed John of Ávila a Doctor of the Universal Church, the 34th to receive this title in 2 millennia of Christianity. In the apostolic letter accompanying the declaration, the Pope called him a master of saints and former of priests, noting that his doctrine on the ordained ministry possesses a relevance that transcends the historical circumstances in which it was formulated. And indeed, John of Ávila's words on the priesthood resonate today with an almost prophetic urgency. In an era marked by scandals that have deeply wounded the Church, his insistence on priestly holiness as an indispensable condition of ministry sounds less like a pious ideal than like an accurate diagnosis and a necessary medicine. The priest must be poor, he said, because whoever seeks riches cannot preach a Christ who was stripped of everything. The priest must be chaste, because whoever does not master his passions cannot guide others toward purity. The priest must be humble, because whoever seeks himself cannot point toward God. The priest must be totally Christ's and totally for souls, without reservations, without half measures, without compromises with the spirit of the world. But to reduce John of Ávila to a master of priests would be to diminish his stature. His teaching reaches every baptized person who takes seriously the universal call to holiness. The Audi, Filia remains today, almost 5 centuries after its composition, a sure guide for anyone who wishes to venture into the paths of the interior life. His collected letters constitute a treasure of spiritual direction applicable to the most diverse circumstances of the soul. His sermons endure as models of Christ-centered preaching, focused not on the preacher's brilliance, but on the glory of Christ and the salvation of the listeners. Today, Saint John of Ávila is the patron of the Spanish secular clergy. His liturgical feast is celebrated every May 10th, the anniversary of his glorious passing. His incorrupt body rests in Montilla, in the church where he breathed his last, a destination for pilgrims who come seeking the intercession of one who in life never turned away anyone who knocked at his door. But his truest legacy lies not in books or relics, but in transformed lives, in every priest who celebrates Mass as if it were the first and the last, in every Christian who seeks holiness amid ordinary occupations, in every soul who discovers that God's love is strong as death and that it is worth wagering everything on Him. There are lives that do not end when the heart stops beating. John of Ávila's is one of them. That priest who never crossed the ocean, conquered territories vaster than any navigator, the souls of an entire people, the conscience of a church in need of reform, the hearts of saints who would change history. He wished to be a martyr in distant lands, and God granted him a more subtle martyrdom, that of daily obedience, of accepted illness, of sustained faithfulness, when everything seemed to conspire against him. His message crosses the centuries with a relevance that shakes us. In a world that has turned lukewarmness into virtue and commitment into a flaw, John of Ávila reminds us that holiness admits no half measures. In a church tempted by worldliness and wounded by the scandals of those who should have been its shepherds, his doctrine on holy priesthood shines like a beacon in the storm. In an age where so many seek God through misguided paths, the Master of Andalusia points to the only true way: Christ crucified, Christ risen, Christ present in every Eucharist. "Lord, it is time to walk," he said as he died. Those words are also for us, pilgrims of the 21st century who seek the same homeland he reached. It is time to walk toward the holiness that God asks of us. It is time to walk toward that Christ whom John preached with his life more than with his words. It is time to walk toward the eternity where he awaits us. Saint John of Ávila, Doctor of the Church and Master of Saints, pray for us.